Alright, this is the presentation for my experience and results for my field project, my field research project. So I moved, my partner and I moved to Florida about 6 weeks ago or so. Actually, it's coming up on 2 months now. And I just thought that option B would be a really great way to get to know the area, to find some of the more natural areas of Southwest Florida. We're in the Fort Myers area. And so I discovered the San Carlos Bay Bunche Beach Preserve, which is at the bottom of the Caloosahatchee River. Took me a while to figure out how to pronounce that, but at the bottom of the Caloosahatchee River that lets out into the Gulf of Mexico. Day one kind of ended up being ill-prepared and really didn't learn too much that day. Well, I did. I just kind of wandered around the environment, but I really didn't get to focus on anything. It was just kind of overwhelming. I didn't really know what I was looking at because there's quite a bit of space. It's a 718-acre reserve, so there's a lot of area to cover, and there's also distinct environments. Day two was a little more prepared, able to get a lot more pictures, and kind of get an idea for how the environment worked, how it interacted. But the thing that I noticed, we went pretty early both of those days, and I noticed that both days on the beachfront, the water was pretty low, the tide was out, and there was a lot of feasting birds. I put in the report that there were dozens upon dozens. I was tempted to write that there were hundreds because there were a lot of birds. And they would just sort of go out. The most common one was the snowy plover I discovered. So they would go out and into the shallow water, and you would just sort of see them just sort of picking away at whatever they could find. And then they're also kind of like these sandbars that have been formed, and you would see them kind of fly out to those as well. And we're obviously finding a lot of organisms beneath the sand to eat. The third day was a couple weeks later. We actually went kayaking. And something that I noticed on that day that kind of confirmed what I noticed days 1 and 2 was as the sun really started to get up in the sky and it started to get hot, like around 11, noon, 1 o'clock, the birds disappeared. They were completely gone from the environment. And they weren't out in the water feeding on anything. They were, other than a couple seagulls, there really wasn't much for birds. Anyway, day 3 we were kayaking, and most of this is just a wetland with streams and little creeks and ponds. There's this big area, big pond area that is that I would say is probably, it's almost like a perfect circle, and it's probably 200 yards wide. And we were told that there's quite a few manatees in this area. I didn't see any there, but we're told that this is where a lot of the manatees will be found if they are found by kayakers. And in here you can immediately notice that the coastline or the water line is all covered with mangroves, which we know mangroves help with flood protection. I also thought it was interesting, this area, and I don't know if this is man-made or not, but I did notice that at the edges of this water, which also happened to be edges of the preserve, there was about 8-foot incline of land. And I thought if there were to be some flooding from the ocean, this could hold a lot of water and could probably prevent damage, because down the road a little bit there is quite a bit of housing and businesses that could get pretty damaged if water came through. So then day 4 we went back, did the same thing, the kayaking, and on that day my buddy who had been visiting from Wisconsin wanted to go fishing, so that was when we went back to that pond area, and we actually went down the Mangrove Tunnel. That's what it was called by the folks who gave us the kayak. It's just a canal, really narrow, so narrow that you almost had to use your paddles on the actual trees to move yourself along, because you couldn't get in the water. You just didn't have enough room, so you just kind of had to navigate with the trees, and it was actually quite difficult to get through. But this was interesting because we were there at the middle of the day when the birds were no longer on the beach, from at least what had been on the previous days. And if you look directly up, you'll see the canopy is thick, broad leaves, and they're pretty dark and they actually seemed to sort of block out the sun. It was a pretty sunny day, and it was pretty dark in there. I mean, it was humid and muggy, but the temperature had dropped a lot. And what did we see in the understory level? Pretty open, covered with birds. So obviously this serves as a refuge for the birds when the sun does start to get a lot hotter. And we saw a lot of the bigger birds here too, so egrets and herons. And what I thought was interesting is I had actually been talking with my partner. We saw an egret just behind me here, and their legs are so long, and I said, it looks like they could break just by walking on them. You know, what evolutionary purpose do those serve? A week later, I kind of found out, because as you go to the shrub level in the mangrove tunnel, you see it gets really thick. There's lots of the mangrove, roots and vines and stuff, and a lot of thick vegetation there, that if you were a bird who was only flying, you would not be able to fly from, that bird would not be able to fly from, perch to perch. But these egrets, these big birds, literally were sort of, using those long legs to move from spot to spot as they sort of hunted for the different insects. And there were these, about this big, these mangrove tree crabs, these little dark brown, black crabs that climb all in the mangroves. I didn't see if any of the birds actually ate them or not, but you could see them sort of hunting, and they dive their head into the water. But without those long legs, there's no way they would be able to navigate that. There was not enough room to fly. They needed those legs, and if you were, a duck or a goose, your legs wouldn't be long enough to get through that. So, and then on day 5, this is when we went back and we were hiking, and this older gentleman came out of absolutely nowhere, and just said to us, "Hey, you want to see something interesting?" Which was a little skeptical, but showed us that gopher tortoise that you can see in the report. And then also he told us about a spot down the way a little bit, down one of the trails, that was he called it the pool. That's why I've been calling it the pool, where when the high tide comes in, the water rolls in, fish roll in, and then when the high tide comes out, it sort of traps the water and traps the fish. And that's when all these birds just sort of congregate there and feast on, all the fish that are trapped there. And we sat there for quite a while watching them sort of just, slowly move along. And then they went down. I mean, it was like a flash, and they would come up with a fish. And it was just a really cool environment. But yeah, so, and like I said earlier, there were very distinct environments. I kind of was able to separate them into 3 environments, one being first the pond. So this is the pond, but then also the rivers and streams. A very distinct environment. I imagine a lot of the wildlife was going on underneath the water. This is where we were told if you wanted to fish, this would be the place. So that means there's a lot of fish there. We're also told this is where the manatees would be. My friend claims he saw one. I'm not sure. But that's where I think a lot of the wildlife would be taking place, is underneath. And this is also where you could see how the mangroves could maybe serve, and the wetlands in general could serve as sort of a water retention area if there was flooding. The second one was obviously the mangrove tunnel. Very distinct environment. Obviously, it seems to protect wildlife from extreme heat, while also just being another sort of feeding ground for different birds and different creatures. And then Bunche Beach being the last one, where we saw the dozens of birds in the morning taking advantage of the low tide. And then something else about Bunche Beach that I did notice was the rock formations there. So we saw a lot of rocks, and they almost seemed to sort of create this wall that potentially blocked the water, because I noticed that as soon as you got past that wall, maybe about 10 feet from that wall, not even, the vegetation really picked up, the green, lush vegetation, the palm trees. So I wonder if almost those rocks serve to protect that vegetation from the water. Because like I said, as soon as you get past that, that's when it really picks up. And I imagine if you move that wall back, maybe go a little bit farther for the vegetation, or it just won't be there at all. Now just kind of a post-mortem on the whole experience. Just some things I would have changed. First, shoes. We wore sandals because we thought, well, it's mainly a beach environment. Shoes will be sandals will be good to go. It's a beach environment, but it is not like your average beach environment. It is rocky, so I would love to have done this whole thing again with like waterproof boots. That's one thing I would change. The other thing was paying closer attention to vegetation. I think with the amount of animal wildlife that I'm just not used to in Wisconsin, with this environment, there's a lot of focus on animal life. Discovered some pretty great things about the animal life. Looked at the mangrove trees, but I would have liked to look more in detail at some of the vegetation. So, for example, when we saw that gopher tortoise, he was in this area where he or she was in this area where there was a lot of different grasses, different little shrubs and stuff, and it would have just kind of been interesting to take more pictures of that to kind of review that. And maybe in the future I'll go take a look at that, but so I would have liked to focus more on that, and then also just take more photos of some of the vegetation so that I could do kind of what I did with the birds, which is kind of start to identify what species of birds these are. And then to kind of conclude the whole thing, this isn't as much, I don't know if this is a conclusion as much as just an observation. Where Bunche Beach is, if you follow it down, you then get to Fort Myers Beach, and then there's this place called Lover's Key. Lover's Key, while it is a public beach, it doesn't have the hotels and the resorts and the restaurants or whatever. It doesn't have any of that. It's very natural. And if you compare that to Bunche Beach, they're very similar. The sand is different. The vegetation is different. And there's a lot more wildlife at both those environments. And separating them in the middle is Fort Myers Beach, where you have hotels, apartments, houses, restaurants, ice cream parlors, the whole Florida beach scene. So what I notice about that is that human activity, that human involvement changes the environment dramatically, because otherwise you would assume that would be one continuous environment, roughly. So yeah, I just think it's important. They started doing this back in 2001 from what I was able to find, protecting Bunche Beach. And yeah, I think it's important to do that because I think, it gives a completely different glimpse of what a natural Florida would be without, the beachfront resorts, which I have no problem with. I enjoy those too, but I think it's important to maintain this environment. And I think it kind of, again, gives us a glimpse of a former Florida, a more natural Florida, which is, I've been to quite a few places in the country, and I will say the natural side of Florida is one of the more unique environments I've come across at least in this country. So anyway, that is my report. Thank you so much.